The mountain man who called himself Fletcher Voss watched from beneath the sprawling oak as the small church doors swung shut in the face of a woman whose beauty struck him like lightning across a summer sky. He had come down from his cabin in the Montana wilderness for supplies, a rare trip he made only when necessity demanded, and he had not expected to witness such cruelty on this bright Sunday morning in June of 1876. The woman stood frozen on the wooden steps, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, her dress clean but obviously mended many times over. Fletcher could see the humiliation burning in her cheeks even from where he stood across the dusty street of Montana City. Reverend Holbrook stood in the doorway, his face hard as granite, his hand firmly gripping the door frame as if to bar her entry with his very body. "I told you last week, Miss Kelley," the Reverend's voice carried across the morning air. "You are not welcome in this house of God until you repent of your father's sins and publicly denounce his actions." Fletcher's jaw tightened. He knew enough about small-town politics to understand what was happening, though he did not know the specifics. The woman, this Miss Kelley, lifted her chin with a dignity that made Fletcher's chest ache. "My father made his choices," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling Fletcher could see in her hands. "I cannot repent for another man's soul, Reverend. I came here to worship, not to perform for your congregation." "Then you will not enter." The door closed with finality. Fletcher found himself moving before he had made a conscious decision, his long legs carrying him across the street in swift strides. The woman had turned away from the church, her shoulders straight despite the obvious blow she had received, and nearly walked directly into his broad chest. "Pardon me," she said, stepping back quickly. Her eyes, he saw, were the color of honey in sunlight, though they shimmered with unshed tears. "Miss Kelley," Fletcher said, removing his worn hat. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and he was aware of how he must look to her, wild and uncivilized after months in the mountains. "I am Fletcher Voss. I apologize for startling you." She looked up at him, taking in his towering height, the breadth of his shoulders beneath the buckskin shirt, the muscles that corded his arms from years of hard labor. Most women in town looked at him with either fear or distaste when he made his infrequent visits. She simply looked tired. "Mr. Voss," she acknowledged, "if you will excuse me." "I saw what happened," he said, the words coming rough and unpracticed. He did not speak much these days, preferring the company of the mountains and the creatures that dwelt there. "It was not right." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right or wrong does not seem to matter much in Montana City. "Good day, sir." He watched her walk away, her spine rigid with pride, and something shifted in his chest. He had lived alone for nearly 8 years, ever since he had left his family's farm in Pennsylvania and headed west. He had seen violence and beauty, had survived winters that killed lesser men, had built a life with his own 2 hands that asked nothing of anyone. But he had never seen anything quite like the courage in this woman's retreating form. Fletcher did not go back to his cabin that day. Instead, he made discreet inquiries in the general store, learning the story of Fiona Kelley and her father Patrick. The elder Kelley had been a gambler and a drunk who had lost everything, including the respect of the town, before dying in a barroom brawl 6 months prior. Fiona, who had tried to keep him from destroying himself, now bore the weight of his disgrace. The church, led by the sanctimonious Reverend Holbrook, had decided she must publicly humiliate herself and beg forgiveness for her father's life before she would be allowed to worship with decent folk. "It is shameful," Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife, whispered as she wrapped his purchases. "The girl is as pious as they come. She reads her Bible every night, I am told, But the reverend has it in his head that the sins of the father must be answered for, and the congregation follows his lead like sheep. Fletcher bought 3 times the lumber he had originally planned to purchase. He loaded it onto his wagon along with his other supplies, then drove out to the small house on the edge of town where Fiona Kelley lived alone. It was a poor structure, badly in need of repair, with a roof that surely leaked in the rain. He knocked on the door and waited. When she opened it, surprise flickered across her features. "Mr. Voss, I did not expect to see you again." "I have a proposition for you, Miss Kelley," he said, turning his hat in his hands. "I would like to build you a chapel." She blinked at him. "I beg your pardon." "A place to worship," he clarified. "In the woods on my land, private where no one can turn you away. I have the timber and the skill. I only need your permission to build it for you." Fiona stared at him as if he had sprouted a second head. "Sir, I do not even know you." "Why would you do such a thing?" Fletcher considered the question. Why indeed? He barely knew himself. "Because what I saw this morning was wrong, because you deserve a place to worship in peace, because I have the means to provide it." He paused. "And because I would like the company if you will accept it." She searched his face, those honey-colored eyes probing for deception or ulterior motive. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she slowly nodded. "I do not understand you, Mr. Voss. But if you are sincere in this offer, then yes, I would be grateful for such a place. Then it is settled." He put his hat back on. "The chapel will be ready within the month. I will come to town when it is finished and show you the way." He left before she could question him further, before he could question himself. As he drove his wagon up into the foothills where his cabin sat nestled among pine and aspen, Fletcher wondered what madness had possessed him. He had left civilization behind for good reason. People brought complications, expectations, pain. The mountains asked nothing of him but respect and hard work. Yet, as he began cutting logs for the chapel the next morning, his muscles straining with familiar effort, Fletcher found himself thinking of honey-colored eyes and quiet dignity. He worked through the heat of the day, his shirt clinging to his broad back, sweat running down the carved muscles of his arms. He had built his cabin alone. He would build this chapel the same way, but this time it would be for someone else. The thought filled him with something he had not felt in years. Purpose beyond mere survival. The summer days passed in a rhythm of labor. Fletcher felled trees and stripped them, notched them and hauled them to the small clearing he had chosen about a quarter-mile from his cabin. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by tall pines, with a view of the mountains to the west. Wildflowers grew in abundance, painting the meadow in purples and yellows and whites. A creek ran nearby, its water clear and cold even in the heat of summer. He laid the foundation with stones from the creek bed, making sure it was level and true. He raised the walls log by log, fitting them together with the precision of a craftsman. The chapel took shape slowly, a small building barely 20 feet by 15, but solid and well made. He carved the door himself, working in the evenings by lamplight, creating a simple cross in the wood. As he worked, Fletcher found his mind returning again and again to Fiona Kelley. He wondered how she spent her days, whether the town continued to shun her, whether she still read her Bible alone each night. He wondered if she ever thought of the strange mountain man who had made her such an unusual promise. 3 weeks into the construction, Fletcher returned to town for more supplies. He saw Fiona outside the general store, a basket on her arm, and their eyes met across the street. She offered him a small smile, tentative but genuine, and he felt warmth spread through his chest. He crossed to her, dodging a wagon in the process. "Miss Kelley," he greeted her, "Mr. Voss, I had wondered if you had forgotten your promise." "I do not make promises lightly," he said. The chapel is nearly complete. Another week, perhaps two. Her eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. Truly, truly. It is not grand, but it is honest work. I think you will find it suits its purpose. I am certain it will be perfect, she said softly. I cannot tell you what this means to me, Mr. Voss. The Sunday services continue to exclude me. I have tried reading scripture at home, but it is not the same as worshiping in a proper place. An older woman walked past them on the boardwalk, her skirts swishing with disapproval. She made a point of pulling them away from Fiona as if she carried some contagion. Fletcher saw the hurt flash across Fiona's face before she schooled her expression back to neutrality. "These people are fools," Fletcher said bluntly. "They are frightened," Fiona corrected him gently. "Frightened of what they do not understand, frightened of judgment. My father was not a good man, Mr. Voss. He hurt people, took their money, broke his promises. They see him when they look at me. Then they are blind as well as foolish." She laughed, a real laugh this time, and the sound made Fletcher's heart skip. "You are very direct, sir. I have no patience for pretense. Life is hard enough without adding lies to it." "I imagine life in the mountains must be very hard indeed," she said. "How long have you lived there?" 8 years. I built my cabin the first winter, nearly died doing it, but I am stubborn. I can see that." Her eyes traced the breadth of his shoulders, the strength evident in every line of his body. "Do you never get lonely?" The question surprised him with its honesty. "Yes," he admitted. "But loneliness is simpler than the alternative. People are complicated. That they are." She shifted her basket to her other arm. "I should go. I have washing to do, and the day is half gone already." Fletcher watched her leave, then completed his business in town and returned to his work. But her question stayed with him. Did he get lonely? Of course he did. But he had chosen solitude, had embraced it as preferable to the disappointments that came with depending on others. His father had taught him that lesson well enough, with fists and fury and impossible expectations. His brothers had reinforced it, competing for scraps of approval that never came. Fletcher had finally realized that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. Yet now he was building a chapel for a woman he barely knew, and the solitude he had cultivated felt less like freedom and more like exile. The final week of construction flew by in a flurry of activity. Fletcher built simple pews from pine, sanded smooth and sturdy. He crafted a small altar and a lectern for the Bible. He made shutters for the windows and hung them carefully. When the last nail was driven and the last board fitted into place, he stepped back to survey his work. The chapel stood in the clearing like a promise kept. Simple and strong, it had a quality of peace about it that pleased him deeply. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the interior with golden light. The scent of fresh cut pine filled the air. It was, he thought, a place worthy of Fiona Kelley's prayers. He rode into Montana City the next morning, arriving at Fiona's house before the heat of the day set in. She answered his knock wearing a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. Fletcher had to remind himself to breathe. "It is finished," he said. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Truly, come and see for yourself. I have my wagon ready." She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Let me get my Bible and my bonnet." The ride up into the foothills took nearly 2 hours. Fletcher drove the wagon carefully, mindful of his precious cargo. Fiona sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes taking in the wild beauty of the landscape as they climbed higher into the mountains. "It is so beautiful here," she said softly. "I have never been this far from town." "The mountains have their own kind of majesty," Fletcher agreed. "Harsh but honest. I prefer them to the company of most people." "Present company excluded, I hope," she said with a small smile. He glanced at her, caught off guard by the teasing note in her voice. "Present company excluded," he confirmed. They reached his property as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Fletcher helped Fiona down from the wagon, his large hands spanning her waist easily. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in his cabin, the well-tended garden, the neat stack of firewood, the tools hung in their proper places. "You have built a good life here," she observed. "I have built a life," he said. "Whether it is good remains to be seen. Come, the chapel is this way." He led her along the path he had worn through the forest, watching her face as they entered the clearing. The chapel stood bathed in morning light, surrounded by wildflowers, backed by the majesty of the mountains. Fiona stopped in her tracks, her hand covering her heart. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, Mr. Voss." Fletcher felt something tight in his chest loosen. "You approve?" She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "Approve? Sir, this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me. I do not have words." "You do not need words," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the depth of emotion in her eyes. "Come inside." He opened the door he had carved and stood back to let her enter. She moved into the small space as if walking on sacred ground, her fingers trailing over the smooth wood of the pews, the altar, the lectern. She walked to the window and looked out at the mountains, then turned back to him. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Why would you spend weeks of labor on a stranger?" Fletcher leaned against the door frame, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "I'm not certain I can answer that in a way that makes sense. I saw you turned away from that church, and something in me rebelled against the injustice of it. You were seeking God, and men got in your way. I thought perhaps I could remove that obstacle. But this," she gestured around the chapel, "this is so much more than simply removing an obstacle. You have created something beautiful, something sacred." He shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I am good with my hands. I had the materials. It seemed the right thing to do." She crossed to him, standing so close he could smell the lavender she used in her soap. "Fletcher Voss," she said, using his first name for the first time, "you are a remarkable man." No one had ever called him remarkable before. He had been called stubborn, wild, uncivilized, dangerous, but never remarkable. He found he had no response to such an observation. "I should return you to town," he said instead. "It will be dark soon if we delay." "May I worship here first?" she asked. "Just a short prayer of thanksgiving, of course. Take all the time you need." He stepped outside to give her privacy, settling himself on a fallen log near the clearing's edge. The sounds of the forest surrounded him, the chirping of birds, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant gurgle of the creek. This was his world, familiar and safe. Yet the woman inside his chapel had somehow become part of it in a matter of weeks. When Fiona emerged nearly an hour later, her face was serene, a glow about her that had nothing to do with the sunlight. "Thank you," she said simply. "That was a gift I shall never forget." They drove back to Montana City in comfortable silence, arriving as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Fletcher helped her down from the wagon in front of her small house. "When may I return?" she asked. "To the chapel, I mean." "Whenever you wish," he said. "I will take you up on Sundays if that suits you, and any other time you have need." "That is very generous of you." "It is selfish," he corrected. "I find I enjoy the company." She smiled up at him, and Fletcher felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. "Then I shall see you Sunday next, Mr. Voss." "Fletcher," he said. "You may call me Fletcher." "Then you must call me Fiona." He tested the name silently, liking the way it felt in his mind. "Fiona, until Sunday." And so a pattern was established. Each Sunday, Fletcher would drive into town and collect Fiona, taking her up to the chapel in the woods. She would worship there for an hour or more while he worked on various projects around his cabin or simply sat and enjoyed the peace of the mountains. Then he would drive her home and they would talk during the journey, sharing pieces of themselves carefully, like precious treasures. Fletcher learned that Fiona was 23 years old, 4 years his junior. She had been born in Boston but moved to Montana with her father when she was 15, after her mother died of consumption. Her father had promised a new start, but instead had fallen deeper into drink and gambling. She had worked as a seamstress to keep food on the table, had tried desperately to save her father from himself, and had ultimately failed. "I still wonder if I could have done more," she confessed one Sunday in late July as they drove back to town. "If I had been a better daughter, perhaps he would have had reason to change." "You cannot save someone who does not wish to be saved," Fletcher said firmly. "I learned that lesson young. My father was a hard man, quick with his fists and slow with his affection. My mother tried to change him for 20 years. She died still trying. The only thing she accomplished was her own misery." Fiona looked at him with new understanding. "Is that why you left? Why you came to the mountains? Part of it." "I also had 3 brothers, all competing for scraps of approval that never came. It was exhausting trying to be good enough, strong enough, worthy enough. I finally realized I would never measure up to whatever standard my father had set, so I stopped trying. I came west and built a life that did not require anyone's approval but my own. That must have taken great courage." "It took desperation," he corrected. "Courage would have been staying and continuing to fight. I simply ran away." "You did not run," Fiona said softly. "You walked away from something destructive and built something constructive. That is wisdom, not cowardice." Her words settled into him, finding cracks he had not known existed. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking beneath them, the horses hoofed steady on the dirt road. "I find myself thinking about the chapel during the week," Fiona said eventually. "About the peace I feel there, about the mountains, about you." Fletcher's hands tightened on the reins. "Do you?" "Yes, is that improper of me? I think about you as well," he admitted. "More than I should, perhaps." She turned to look at him fully. "Why should you not think of me, Fletcher?" "Because I have nothing to offer a woman like you. I live alone in the mountains. My life is hard work and solitude. You deserve better. You deserve society, comfort, security." "What I deserve," Fiona said with a flash of spirit, "is a life of my choosing, not one dictated by what others think appropriate. And I find, Fletcher Voss, that I am quite drawn to mountain men who build chapels for rejected women." He pulled the wagon to a stop, there on the side of the road with the mountains rising around them. "Fiona, you should know that I am not a man of pretty words or gentle manners. I have lived rough for a long time. I do not know how to court a woman properly." "I do not want proper," she said. "I want honest. I want real. I want someone who sees me, not my father's mistakes, and I believe you might be that someone." Fletcher reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his calloused hand. "I see you, Fiona Kelley. I see your strength and your faith. I see your kindness and your courage, and I find myself wanting to know more, to see deeper, to understand everything that makes you who you are." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "Then perhaps we should allow ourselves that discovery." He kissed her there on the mountain road, a kiss that tasted of promise and possibility. It was not practiced or smooth, but it was honest, and that made it perfect. When they pulled apart, both were breathing harder, both wore expressions of wonder. "I should get you home," Fletcher said, his voice rough, "before the whole town decides your reputation is beyond saving." "Let them think what they will," Fiona said, but she settled back in her seat. My reputation could hardly be worse than it already is. As summer deepened into August, Fletcher and Fiona's relationship deepened as well. He began coming to town more frequently, helping her with repairs on her small house, bringing her fresh game from his hunts, finding excuses to spend time in her company. She taught him about poetry and literature, reading aloud to him while he worked. He taught her about the mountains, about tracking and survival, about the names of the wildflowers that grew in such profusion around the chapel. The town noticed, of course. Tongues wagged about the scandalous sight of the disgraced Fiona Kelley keeping company with the wild mountain man. Reverend Holbrook made pointed comments from his pulpit about moral degradation and the company of sinners, but Fletcher and Fiona paid them no mind. They had found something rare and precious, and neither was willing to let small-minded gossip destroy it. One Sunday in early September, after Fiona had finished her worship in the chapel, Fletcher invited her to his cabin for a meal. She accepted, curious to see more of his world. The cabin was larger than she had expected, built with the same care and precision as the chapel. Inside, it was tidy and functional with a large stone fireplace, a well-made bed, shelves lined with books, and cooking implements hung neatly on the walls. "You raid," she said with surprise, noting the collection of volumes. "I am not completely uncivilized," he said with a hint of amusement. "I spent my first winter here working through every book I had brought with me twice over." Reading helped pass the time when the snow was too deep to do anything else. She examined his collection, noting works by Shakespeare, Thoreau, Whitman, and others. "These are not the books of an uneducated man. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She made sure all her sons could read and cipher. It was the one gift she could give us that my father could not take away." Fiona turned to him, her heart aching for the boy he had been. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. She deserved better than the life she got. "Perhaps that is why you built me the chapel," Fiona said softly. "Perhaps you were giving me what you could not give her, a place of peace and sanctuary." Fletcher stilled, considering her words. "Perhaps," he said finally. "I had not thought of it that way, but you may be right." He prepared a simple meal of venison stew and fresh bread, and they ate together as the afternoon light slanted through the cabin windows. Fiona felt a contentment she had not experienced in years, perhaps ever. Here in this simple cabin with this complex man, she felt truly seen and truly valued. "Stay," Fletcher said suddenly. She looked up from her plate. "What? Not tonight," he clarified quickly. "I mean permanently. Marry me, Fiona. Stay here in the mountains. Let me take care of you." Her heart leapt even as her practical mind raised objections. "Fletcher, we have known each other barely 3 months. I know, it is fast, but I am certain. I have been alone for 8 years, and I thought I preferred it that way. Then you walked into my life, and suddenly my cabin feels empty when you are not here. The chapel stands waiting for you every day. I find myself listening for your voice, hoping to hear your thoughts on everything from the weather to philosophy. I do not need more time to know that I want you in my life permanently." Fiona set down her fork, her hands trembling. "The town already scorns me. If I moved up here with you, unmarried, it would only confirm everything they believe about my lack of moral character. Then we will marry before you move. Tomorrow, if you will have me, we can find a judge in Helena, make it legal and proper. Then there can be no question. You would do that, leave your mountains and travel to Helena. Fiona, I would cross the country if it meant securing your happiness. Helena is a day's journey. That is nothing." She stood and crossed to him, and he rose to meet her. She placed her hands on his broad chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "You are asking me to give up the only life I have ever known." I am asking you to begin a new life with me, a better life, one where you are valued and cherished, one where you can worship freely and live honestly, one where we can build something together. What if I cannot adapt to mountain life? What if I hate the isolation? Then we will find a compromise. Perhaps a house on the edge of town, where I can still access the mountains but you are not so isolated. I am not asking you to stop being who you are, Fiona. I am asking you to be who you are with me. She looked up into his weathered face, into eyes that had seen hardship but still held hope. She thought of the chapel he had built for her, the care he had shown, the genuine affection that colored every interaction. She thought of her lonely house in town, the cold shoulders and whispered judgments, the life of quiet desperation that stretched before her if she remained. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Fletcher Voss." He lifted her off her feet in a crushing embrace, spinning her around the cabin while she laughed with joy and relief. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, his large hands gentle on her face despite the strength in them. They traveled to Helena the next day, a 12-hour journey on horseback that tested Fiona's endurance but filled her with excitement. Fletcher was patient with her inexperience, stopping frequently to rest, pointing out landmarks and wildlife, telling her stories of his early days in the mountains. In Helena, they found a judge who agreed to marry them that very evening. The ceremony was simple, conducted in the judge's office with his wife and clerk as witnesses. Fiona wore her best dress, a green calico that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. Fletcher had purchased a new shirt for the occasion, though he refused to abandon his buckskin trousers and boots. When the judge pronounced them married, Fletcher kissed his bride with reverence and passion combined. Fiona felt tears slip down her cheeks, tears of happiness and relief, and the overwhelming sense that she had finally found where she belonged. They spent their wedding night in a modest hotel, and Fletcher showed Fiona the depth of his feeling with a gentleness she had not expected from such a rough man. He worshipped her body as he might a sacred text, learning every curve and hollow, bringing her pleasure she had not known existed. She, in turn, explored the magnificent landscape of his muscled form, tracing scars and strength with wondering fingers. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Fiona felt a peace settle over her soul. "I love you," she whispered into the night. "And I love you," Fletcher rumbled back, "more than I thought myself capable of loving anything." They returned to Montana City 2 days later to collect Fiona's belongings. The news of their marriage spread through town like wildfire, generating reactions ranging from shock to schadenfreude. Reverend Holbrook declared from his pulpit that Fiona had sealed her fate, aligning herself with a godless mountain man. The irony was not lost on Fletcher, who had built his wife a more genuine place of worship than Holbrook's church would ever be. Mrs. Patterson from the general store surprised them both by offering congratulations and a wedding gift of fine linens. "I always thought the Reverend was too harsh with you," she confided to Fiona. "Your father's mistakes were not yours to bear. I hope you will be very happy." They loaded Fiona's few possessions into Fletcher's wagon and made the journey up to the cabin that was now her home. Fletcher carried her over the threshold, another custom observed, and set her down gently in the center of the main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Voss," he said. The name sent a thrill through her. "It will take some adjustment, I think, but yes, this is home now." The adjustment proved easier than Fiona had anticipated. She had always been adaptable, and Fletcher was patient with her learning curve. He taught her how to tend the garden, how to preserve food for winter, how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds and the behavior of the animals. She proved surprisingly adept at mountain life, her strength and determination overcoming any lack of experience. In turn, she made the cabin into a true home. She sewed curtains for the windows, arranged wildflowers in jars on the table, cooked meals that made Fletcher groan with pleasure. She read to him in the evenings while he carved or mended tools, her voice filling the cabin with culture and beauty. They worshiped together in the chapel every Sunday, and Fletcher found himself understanding the appeal of faith when shared with someone he loved. As autumn painted the mountains in gold and crimson, Fiona discovered she was with child. She told Fletcher one evening as they sat by the fire, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms, his face alight with joy and fear combined. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as I can be. I have missed my monthly courses twice now, and I have been feeling strange in the mornings." "We must take care of you," he said immediately. "No more heavy work. You must rest." She laughed at his protectiveness. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Fletcher. I am not made of glass. You are precious cargo now," he insisted. "You and the child both. I will not take chances." True to his word, Fletcher became even more attentive as Fiona's pregnancy progressed. He took over all the heavy chores, insisted she rest frequently, made sure she ate well and stayed warm as winter descended on the mountains. His concern was touching, if sometimes excessive. The first snow fell in late October, transforming the world into a wonderland of white and silence. Fletcher had prepared well, laying in supplies, cutting extra firewood, making sure every gap in the cabin walls was chinked tight against the cold. Fiona marveled at his competence, the way he anticipated needs before they arose, the way he planned for contingencies she would never have considered. As her belly swelled with their child, Fiona found herself falling more deeply in love with her husband. She saw the man beneath the rough exterior, the capacity for tenderness that he had buried for so long. He talked to their unborn baby in the evenings, his large hand resting on her stomach, telling stories of the mountains and making promises about the life they would build together. Winter in the mountains was harsh but beautiful. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and the temperature dropped so low that the sap froze in the trees with sounds like gunshots. But inside the cabin, warmth reigned. Fletcher kept the fire burning constantly, and they spent the long evenings in companionable togetherness. He carved a cradle for the baby, each detail lovingly rendered. She sewed tiny clothes, her heart overflowing at the thought of the child who would wear them. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, but Fiona never felt trapped. Instead, she felt cocooned in a world of their own making, safe and cherished. Fletcher proved to be excellent company, full of stories from his years in the mountains, capable of thoughtful conversation on any number of topics. They talked about everything and nothing, building the foundation of their marriage with words and silences equally. As spring approached and Fiona's time drew near, Fletcher grew increasingly anxious. "We should go to town," he said repeatedly. "Find a doctor or a midwife." "What if something goes wrong?" Mrs. Patterson told me about a midwife named Sarah who lives about 10 miles west of here, Fiona reminded him. "She has delivered hundreds of babies. We can send for her when my time comes." 10 miles is too far. What if the baby comes quickly? "Then you will have to deliver our child yourself," Fiona said calmly. "Women have been giving birth in the wilderness since the beginning of humanity, Fletcher. We will be fine." But she sent him to fetch Sarah the midwife a week before her due date, just to ease his mind. Sarah was a capable woman in her 50s who had indeed delivered countless babies. She took one look at Fiona and pronounced her in excellent health. "Strong as an ox, this one," Sarah said approvingly. "Mountain life agrees with her. The baby should come easily enough, all things being equal." First babies can be unpredictable, though. I have seen labors last 2 hours and labors last 2 days. We will just have to wait and see." She stayed in the cabin's small guest room, the one Fletcher had hastily added when he learned of Fiona's pregnancy. The three of them settled into an easy routine, waiting for the baby to decide it was ready to join the world. Fiona's labor began on a bright morning in early April, as the first wildflowers pushed through the melting snow. The pain started as a dull ache in her back and slowly intensified through the day. Sarah coached her through each contraction while Fletcher paced the cabin like a caged bear, desperate to help but unsure how. "Let him hold my hand," Fiona gasped during a particularly strong contraction. "He needs to feel useful." Fletcher needed no further invitation. He positioned himself behind Fiona, supporting her weight, letting her squeeze his hands with crushing force. He murmured encouragement in her ear, telling her how strong she was, how brave, how much he loved her. His presence anchored her through the pain, giving her strength to continue. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Fiona gave a final push and brought their son into the world. The baby's cry filled the cabin, strong and healthy, and Fiona collapsed back against Fletcher's chest, exhausted and elated. "A boy," Sarah announced, quickly cleaning the infant and wrapping him in a soft blanket. "A big, healthy boy. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a set of lungs that could wake the dead." She placed the baby in Fiona's arms, and Fletcher leaned over his wife's shoulder to stare at their son in wonder. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would likely turn the same honey color as his mother's. His tiny fist waved in the air and his face scrunched up as he cried. "He is perfect," Fletcher said hoarsely. "You are perfect. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you for this gift." They named him Franklin, after Fiona's grandfather, with the middle name of Victor for Fletcher's mother, whose maiden name had been Victor. Little Franklin proved to be a content baby once he figured out nursing, sleeping in his hand-carved cradle near his parents' bed, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. Fletcher proved to be a devoted father, taking to the role with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He would hold Franklin for hours, just watching him sleep, studying every detail of his son's face as if committing it to memory. He sang to him, rough lullabies learned from his own mother, and took him outside to show him the mountains that would be his inheritance. Fiona watched her husband with their son and felt her heart might burst from happiness. This was the life she had never dared dream of, the family she had stopped hoping for when her father's disgrace had marked her as untouchable. Now she had a husband who loved her, a son who needed her, and a home in the wilderness that felt more welcoming than any place she had ever known. As Franklin grew from an infant into a toddler, the little family flourished. Fletcher continued to provide for them through hunting and trapping, supplemented by the garden Fiona tended with Franklin strapped to her back. They made occasional trips to Montana City for supplies, and each time, Fiona noticed the town's attitude toward them softening slightly. It was hard to maintain prejudice against a family so obviously content, a child so clearly thriving. Reverend Holbrook never apologized for his treatment of Fiona, but a new minister arrived when Holbrook retired in 1879, and this man, Reverend James, was cut from different cloth. He made a point of visiting the Voss family in their mountain home, admiring the chapel Fletcher had built, and inviting them to visit the church in town whenever they wished. "All are welcome in God's house," he said simply. "The mistakes of the past need not define the future." Fiona thanked him but declined. She had her chapel in the woods, built by love and devotion, and no town church could compare to the peace she found there. Besides, She rather enjoyed worshiping with only her family as congregation. Fletcher had developed a simple but genuine faith through his years with her, and hearing him pray in his rough, honest way moved her more than any polished sermon. In the summer of 1881, Fiona became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy felt easier, her body knowing what to do. Fletcher was no less protective, but he had learned to channel his concern more productively, preparing for their expanding family by adding another room to the cabin and building a larger bed for Franklin, who was growing like a weed. Their second child, a daughter they named Faith Victoria, arrived on a snowy December night. The labor was shorter than Franklin's had been, and Sarah the midwife declared it one of the easiest deliveries she had attended. Faith had her father's dark hair and a disposition as peaceful as a summer morning. Franklin, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit next to her cradle for hours, telling her stories in his childish babble, bringing her flowers and interesting rocks he had found. Fletcher watched his children together and saw the family he had never had, siblings who loved each other, protected each other, built each other up instead of tearing each other down. The years flowed by like the creek that ran near the chapel, steady and sure. Franklin grew tall and strong like his father, learning to track and hunt, to read the wilderness and respect its dangers. Faith proved to be bookish like her mother, always with her nose in a story, though she could handle a rifle as well as her brother when necessary. In 1885, a third child joined them, another boy they named Finn, completing their family. Fletcher's love for Fiona never diminished. If anything, it deepened with each passing year, each shared joy and overcome challenge. He still brought her wildflowers on Sunday mornings, still read poetry to her by firelight, still looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. And she loved him with equal intensity, marveling at the gentleness in such a strong man, the depth of feeling in someone who claimed to be rough and simple. They celebrated their 10th anniversary in 1886 with a trip to the chapel, just the two of them while Sarah watched the children. They renewed their vows there in the small building that had started it all, promising again to love and cherish each other through whatever came. "You remember the day I brought you here for the first time?" Fletcher asked as they stood in the chapel afterward, holding hands. "I thought you were mad," Fiona admitted. "A stranger building me a church in the wilderness. It made no sense." "It still makes no sense," he said with a smile, "but I am glad I did it anyway. So am I. This chapel changed my life, Fletcher. It gave me a place to worship, yes, but more than that, it gave me you. It showed me that there were still good people in the world, people who acted from kindness rather than judgment. You gave me my life back," he said seriously. "I was existing before I met you, surviving, but not really living. You taught me that isolation was not the same as peace, that connection did not have to mean pain. You gave me a family, Fiona. You gave me a purpose beyond simple survival." She reached up to cup his bearded face, noting the silver that was beginning to thread through his dark hair. They were both older now, marked by time and weather and the work of building a life together. But the love between them burned as bright as ever. "We have been blessed," she said softly. "Despite everything, despite how we started, we have been so blessed. We have been stubborn," he corrected with a smile. "Blessed, yes, but also determined. We refused to let other people's prejudices dictate our happiness. We chose each other and chose to make it work. That we did." They made love there in the chapel, on the soft blankets Fletcher had brought for the purpose, surrounded by the sacred space that had brought them together. It was not scandalous, Fiona thought afterward. It was another form of worship, honoring the love that God had given them, celebrating the bond that had created their family, As they grew older, Fletcher and Fiona settled into the comfortable rhythms of long marriage. They knew each other's moods and patterns, could communicate with a glance or a touch, had built a partnership that required little discussion because they were so attuned to each other. Their children grew strong and capable, learning from both parents, becoming people of character and faith. Franklin eventually married a girl from Montana City, a sensible woman named Elizabeth who loved the mountains as much as he did. They built a cabin near Fletcher and Fiona's, close enough to help but far enough for privacy. Faith shocked everyone by deciding to become a teacher, taking her love of learning and turning it into a vocation. She taught in Helena but visited often, bringing books and stories and intellectual stimulation. Finn, the baby, grew into a quiet, thoughtful young man who had inherited his father's skill with his hands. He became a furniture maker, creating pieces of such beauty that people traveled from hundreds of miles to commission his work. Fletcher and Fiona became grandparents, welcoming Franklin and Elizabeth's children with joy. They passed on the stories and skills they had accumulated, teaching the next generation about the mountains, about faith, about the importance of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. The chapel in the woods remained a constant presence in their lives. They still worshiped there every Sunday, sometimes joined by their children and grandchildren, sometimes alone together as they had been in the beginning. Fletcher maintained it carefully, repairing any damage from weather or time, keeping it as perfect as the day he had completed it. On their 25th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the chapel for a special service. Reverend James, who had become a good friend over the years, agreed to lead the ceremony. He spoke about love and faith, about the courage it took to build something lasting, about the example Fletcher and Fiona had set for their children and their community. This chapel, he said, gesturing to the simple building around them, was built as an act of love and defiance. Defiance of cruelty and smallness of spirit. Love for a woman who deserved better than what the world was offering her. And from that act of love and defiance, a family has grown. A family that demonstrates daily what it means to live with integrity, with faith, with devotion to each other and to God. May we all be so blessed. Fiona leaned against Fletcher's shoulder, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, and felt a profound gratitude wash over her. She thought back to that Sunday morning so long ago when Reverend Holbrook had shut the church door in her face. She had felt so alone then, so marked by her father's failures, so uncertain of her future. If someone had told her then that the mountain man watching from across the street would become her husband, her partner, the father of her children, she would have thought them mad. But life, she had learned, often surprised you in the most wonderful ways. Fletcher pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she knew without words that he was thinking similar thoughts. They had both come from difficult places, both carried wounds from their pasts. But they had found each other, and had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their former lives. The years continued their inevitable march. Fletcher's body, so strong for so long, began to show signs of age. His back bothered him on cold mornings, and his hands grew stiff with arthritis. But he remained active, refusing to slow down more than necessary, still chopping wood and tending the property with Finn's help. Fiona's dark hair turned silver, and her face lined with the passage of time. But her eyes remained the same honey color that had captivated Fletcher so long ago, and her spirit burned as bright as ever. She still read voraciously, still tended her garden, still worshipped in the chapel with unwavering devotion. They talked sometimes about the future, about what would happen when one of them was gone. It was not a morbid conversation, but a practical one. Two people who had always faced reality head-on discussing the inevitable. "Promise me," Fiona said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, "that you will not become a hermit again if I go first. Promise me you will stay close to the children, that you will let them care for you." "I promise," Fletcher said, "though I do not intend to let you go anywhere without me. We do not always get a choice in such matters. Then I promise, but you must promise me something as well." "What is that?" "Promise me that you will be happy. That you will not waste time in grief, but will celebrate the life we built together. Promise me you will still go to the chapel, that you will remember how much I loved you every time you walk through that door." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I promise. Though I think celebrating while grieving might be difficult." "You are the strongest person I know," Fletcher said. "You survived your father's disgrace, the town's judgment, your first winter in the mountains when you had no idea what you were doing. You can survive anything, Fiona Voss." But as it turned out, they did not have to test those promises for many years yet. They lived into their 60s, both still relatively healthy, still devoted to each other, still finding joy in simple things. They watched their grandchildren grow, celebrated births and marriages, mourned the occasional loss, and through it all, remained each other's anchor. On their 30th anniversary, Fletcher surprised Fiona by commissioning Finn to create a beautiful wooden cross for the chapel, carved with intricate detail, inlaid with precious woods. When he presented it to her, explaining that Finn had been working on it in secret for months, Fiona wept. "It is too much," she protested. "It is not nearly enough," Fletcher corrected. "Nothing could be enough to repay what you have given me, Fiona, but this seems appropriate, a symbol of faith for the chapel that started our life together." They hung the cross above the altar, and it became the focal point of the small building, beautiful and meaningful. Fiona touched it every time she entered the chapel, remembering the journey that had brought them to this place, thanking God for the blessings that had flowed from one act of kindness so many years ago. As they entered their final years together, Fletcher and Fiona found themselves reflecting more and more on their life. They told stories to their grandchildren, wanting to pass on the history, the lessons, the love that had defined their marriage. "Your grandfather built me a chapel when no one else would let me worship," Fiona would tell them. "He saw me refused entry to the church, and instead of simply feeling bad for me, he did something about it. That is the kind of man he is. That is the kind of person you should strive to be. Someone who acts on their convictions, who stands up for what is right, who builds something beautiful out of injustice. Your grandmother taught me that strength comes in many forms," Fletcher would add. "She survived things that would have broken most people, and she did it with grace and faith. She taught me that opening your heart is not weakness but the greatest courage of all." On a warm summer evening in 1891, 32 years after they had first met, Fletcher and Fiona sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Their children were grown and independent, their grandchildren thriving, their legacy secure. They had lived full lives, rich with love and purpose, and they had no regrets. "I would do it all again," Fiona said quietly. "Every moment, every choice, every challenge. I would do it all again just to end up here with you." "As would I," Fletcher agreed, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Fiona Voss, the very best thing." They sat in comfortable silence as night fell completely, the mountains dark silhouettes against the starlit sky. The chapel stood nearby, a testament to love and faith, still solid and strong after 3 decades. Inside the cabin, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called and another answered. It was a perfect moment, simple and profound, the culmination of a life built together one day at a time. Neither of them knew how many more such moments they would have, but they cherished this one, holding tight to each other and to the love that had sustained them through everything. Years later, long after both Fletcher and Fiona had passed peacefully within months of each other, the chapel still stood in its clearing in the woods. Their descendants maintained it carefully, understanding its significance, honoring the love story that had begun there. It became a place where couples in the family married, where babies were baptized, where the family gathered for important occasions. The story of how it came to be was passed down through generations, growing slightly more romantic with each telling, but never losing its essential truth. A mountain man had seen a woman refused entry to a church, and instead of walking away, he had built her a chapel of her own. From that act of kindness and defiance, a love had grown that blessed everyone it touched. The wooden cross Finn had created still hung above the altar, beautiful and enduring. Carved into its base in letters small but clear were words Fletcher had asked his son to add. Built with love for Fiona, 1876. May all who enter here find peace. And they did. The chapel remained a place of peace and sanctuary, a reminder that love could triumph over judgment, that faith could flourish anywhere, and that sometimes the most sacred spaces were the ones built by human hands guided by devoted hearts. The mountains stood eternal watch over it, and the wildflowers continued to bloom each spring, painting the clearing in the same riot of color that had greeted Fiona on that first visit so long ago. The love story of Fletcher and Fiona Voss became legend in Montana, told and retold, inspiring others to act with courage and kindness, to stand against injustice, to build something beautiful in response to cruelty. Their legacy lived on not just in their descendants, but in the countless lives touched by their example. And on quiet Sunday mornings, when the light slanted just right through the chapel windows, those who gathered there swore they could feel the presence of the couple who had loved so deeply, worshipped so faithfully, and built so well. It was as if Fletcher and Fiona had poured so much love into that small building that it had become permanently infused into the very wood and stone, blessing all who entered with the same peace and devotion that had characterized their remarkable life together.